In the autumn of 1883, when the leaves turned to copper and gold, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching winter, Marcus Bennett found himself standing at a crossroads he had never anticipated. The small town of Meadowbrook, nestled in a valley where the river ran clear and cold, had always been his sanctuary, a place where life moved with the predictable rhythm of seasons and harvests. Yet on this particular October evening, as shadows lengthened across the cobblestone streets and gas lamps flickered to life one by one, Marcus felt the ground beneath his feet shift in ways that had nothing to do with the earth itself. He had known Rosalind Harper for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, though he would never admit to anyone that he had been counting. She had arrived in Meadowbrook that summer, a woman of quiet grace and unexpected depth, with eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations before a single word was spoken. Rosalind had taken a position as a teacher at the town's modest schoolhouse, and from the moment Marcus had first seen her standing in the doorway of the general store, her arms full of books and her expression one of determined independence, something within him had awakened that he thought had long been dormant. Have you ever met someone who changed the entire trajectory of your life in an instant? Someone whose presence made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? Marcus was a man of 32 years, a carpenter by trade, and a solitary soul by habit. He had built half the homes in Meadowbrook with his own hands, had crafted furniture that would outlast generations, and had earned the respect of every person in town through his skill and his integrity. But he had also built walls around his heart, walls as sturdy and impenetrable as any structure he had ever created. The reasons for these walls were buried deep, rooted in a past he rarely spoke of, a loss that had shaped him in ways both visible and invisible. His father had been a harsh man, quick with criticism and slow with affection, and his mother had died when Marcus was barely 14, leaving him to navigate the treacherous waters of adolescence alone. He had learned early that vulnerability was dangerous, that opening oneself to another person meant risking a pain so profound it could break you entirely. So he had chosen safety over connection, solitude over the messy complications of intimacy. He had convinced himself that this was enough, that a life of honest work and quiet evenings was all he needed or deserved. Then Rosalind had arrived, and everything he had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Their courtship, if it could be called that, had been a dance of hesitation and longing. They had encountered each other at church socials and town gatherings, had exchanged pleasantries that gradually deepened into conversations of substance. Rosalind spoke of books and ideas with a passion that both fascinated and intimidated Marcus. She had traveled, had seen cities he could barely imagine, and yet she had chosen to make her home in this small, unremarkable town. When he asked her why, she had smiled in that enigmatic way of hers and said simply, "Sometimes we find what we're looking for in the most unexpected places." What are you searching for in the unexpected places of your own life? Are you brave enough to recognize it when it appears? As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself drawn to Rosalind with an intensity that frightened him. He would find excuses to walk past the schoolhouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of her through the windows as she taught her students. He would linger at the church after services, engaging in conversations with neighbors he barely knew, just for the chance that she might join them. And when they did speak, when her attention was focused entirely on him, he felt simultaneously more alive and more terrified than he had ever been. Harrison Richardson, Marcus's closest friend and the town's blacksmith, had noticed the change in him immediately. Harrison was a bear of a man, with hands like anvils and a heart as generous as the summer sun. He had known Marcus since they were boys, had witnessed the gradual closing off that had occurred after Marcus's mother died, and he had watched with growing concern as his friend had retreated further and further into himself over the years. One evening in late September, as they sat together in Harrison's workshop, the forge glowing red in the gathering darkness, Harrison had spoken plainly. "You're in love with her," he had said, not as a question but as a statement of undeniable fact. Marcus had tried to deny it, had stammered out protests that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Harrison had simply shaken his head and continued, The question isn't whether you love her, Marcus. The question is whether you're going to let that love destroy you or save you. Those words had haunted Marcus in the days that followed. He knew that Harrison was right, knew that he stood at a precipice where he would have to make a choice. He could continue as he had been, keeping Rosalind at arm's length, maintaining the careful distance that had protected him for so long. Or he could take the terrifying step of opening himself completely, of allowing her to see all the broken and damaged parts of him that he had spent years hiding from the world. The thought of such vulnerability made his chest tighten with anxiety. What if she saw who he really was and turned away? What if he gave her his heart and she crushed it, whether intentionally or not? What if he allowed himself to need her, to depend on her presence in his life, and then she left, as everyone he had ever loved had left? The fear was paralyzing, a weight that pressed down on him with every breath. Think about the walls you've built around your own heart. What are they protecting you from? And what might they be preventing you from experiencing? Yet, there was another fear, equally powerful, that had begun to take root in Marcus's mind. It was the fear of regret, the fear that he would look back on this moment years from now and realize that he had let the most important thing in his life slip away because he had been too afraid to reach for it. He imagined himself as an old man, alone in a house he had built with his own hands, surrounded by beautiful things but empty of love, and the image filled him with a dread that was almost physical in its intensity. It was Wesley Carter, the town's elderly physician and a man of considerable wisdom, who had provided Marcus with the perspective he desperately needed. Marcus had gone to see Wesley under the pretense of discussing some repairs needed at the doctor's home, but Wesley had seen through the ruse immediately. Over cups of strong coffee in Wesley's cluttered study, surrounded by medical texts and the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime, the old doctor had shared his own story. Wesley had been married for 43 years to a woman named Catherine, who had died the previous winter. He spoke of her with a tenderness that brought tears to Marcus's eyes, describing a love that had been both profound and imperfect, filled with joy and sorrow in equal measure. "I was terrified when I first told her I loved her," Wesley had confessed, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I was convinced she would laugh at me, or worse, that she would say yes, and then I would somehow fail her. But Catherine taught me something that took me years to truly understand. She taught me that love isn't about the absence of fear. It's about choosing to love despite the fear, about deciding that the possibility of joy is worth the risk of pain." Those words had resonated with Marcus in a way that nothing else had. He realized that he had been waiting for the fear to disappear, for some magical moment when he would feel completely certain and unafraid. But Wesley had shown him that such a moment would never come. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. When was the last time you chose courage over comfort? What might be waiting for you on the other side of your fear? The evening that would change everything came on a crisp October night, when the harvest moon hung low and golden in the sky. There was to be a dance at the town hall, a celebration of the season's bounty, and Marcus had spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation. He had decided, with a determination that both exhilarated and terrified him, that tonight would be the night he would tell Rosalind how he felt. He would lay his heart bare, would risk everything on the chance that she might feel the same way. He arrived at the town hall early, his best suit pressed, and his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his collar. The hall was decorated with autumn leaves and bundles of wheat, and the air was filled with the sounds of fiddles tuning and neighbors greeting one another. Marcus positioned himself near the entrance, his eyes scanning the arriving guests for any sign of Rosalind. When she finally appeared, his breath caught in his throat. She wore a dress of deep burgundy, simple but elegant, and her dark hair was arranged in a way that framed her face beautifully. But it was her smile, warm and genuine as she caught sight of him, that nearly undid his resolve. She crossed the room to him, and he felt as though everyone else had faded away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of possibility. They danced together, and Marcus was acutely aware of every point of contact between them. The warmth of her hand in his, the way she moved with a natural grace that made him feel clumsy by comparison. They talked, their conversation flowing easily, despite the nervous energy that thrummed through his veins. And as the evening wore on, as the music swelled, and the laughter of their neighbors filled the air, Marcus felt his courage building. Finally, as the dance was winding down and couples were beginning to drift toward home, Marcus asked Rosalind if he might walk her back to her boarding house. She agreed, and they stepped out into the cool night air, their breath visible in small clouds. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the celebration fading behind them, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. When they reached the gate of her boarding house, Marcus knew that this was the moment. His heart was pounding so hard he was certain she must be able to hear it. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, her eyes were luminous, questioning. He opened his mouth to speak, and for a terrible moment, no words came. The fear rose up in him like a wave, threatening to pull him under, to send him running back to the safety of his solitude. But then he thought of Wesley's words, of Harrison's challenge, of all the years he had spent hiding from life. And he thought of Rosalind, of the way she made him feel alive in ways he had forgotten were possible. He thought of the future that might be waiting for them if he could just find the courage to reach for it. "Rosalind," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something, and I'm terrified that saying it will change everything between us. But I'm more terrified of not saying it, of letting this moment pass and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." She was watching him intently now, her expression unreadable, and he forced himself to continue. "I've spent most of my life building walls, keeping people at a distance because I was afraid of being hurt. But you've somehow managed to slip past every defense I've ever constructed. You've made me want things I thought I'd given up on, made me believe that maybe I deserve more than the half-life I've been living." He paused, gathering his courage for the final leap. "I'm in love with you, Rosalind. Completely, terrifyingly in love with you. And I know I'm not the most eloquent man, and I know I come with more baggage than any woman should have to deal with, but I'm asking you to take a chance on me. I'm asking you to let me love you, even though I'm scared out of my mind and have no idea what I'm doing." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Marcus watched as emotions flickered across Rosalind's face, too quick for him to read. He braced himself for rejection, for the gentle letdown that would confirm all his worst fears. Then Rosalind smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Marcus Bennett," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face with a tenderness that made his eyes sting with unshed tears. "I've been waiting for you to say something like that for weeks now. I've been falling in love with you too, and I've been just as terrified as you are." The relief that flooded through Marcus was so intense it was almost painful. "You have?" he managed to say, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Of course I have," she replied, her smile widening. "Did you think you were the only one who was afraid? I came to Meadowbrook to escape my own past, my own fears. I've been hurt before, Marcus. I've had my heart broken in ways that made me think I'd never risk it again. But then I met you, and I realized that hiding from love isn't the same as protecting yourself from pain. It's just another kind of pain, a slower, lonelier kind. What would it mean for you to stop hiding from love, from connection, from the vulnerability that makes us fully human?" Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, and he didn't care. He pulled Rosalind into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, because in that moment, she was. They stood there together under the harvest moon, two people who had been broken by life and fear, choosing to be brave enough to try again. In the months that followed, Marcus and Rosalind built a life together that was far from perfect, but infinitely richer than anything either of them had known before. They married in the spring, in a simple ceremony at the church with the whole town in attendance. Harrison stood as Marcus's best man, grinning broadly and whispering, "I told you so," just before the ceremony began. Wesley was there too, his eyes bright with tears as he watched two people he cared for choose love over fear. Their marriage was not without its challenges. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, when the walls they had both built threatened to go back up. There were arguments and misunderstandings, times when the vulnerability required by true intimacy felt like too much to bear. But they had made a commitment to each other and to themselves, a commitment to keep choosing love even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to retreat. Marcus learned that loving someone didn't mean losing himself, as he had always feared. Instead, he found that opening his heart to Rosalind had opened him to the world in ways he had never imagined. He became more engaged with his community, more willing to form friendships and connections. He discovered that the capacity for love wasn't finite, that giving his heart to Rosalind had somehow expanded his ability to care for others as well. Rosalind, for her part, found in Marcus a partner who saw her completely and loved her, not despite her flaws, but because of the whole, complex person she was. She had spent so much of her life trying to be perfect, trying to protect herself by being invulnerable, and Marcus had shown her that true strength came from allowing herself to be seen, imperfections and all. Years later, when they were old and gray, sitting together on the porch of the home Marcus had built for them with his own hands, they would look back on that October night as the moment their real lives had begun. They would tell their grandchildren about the importance of courage, about choosing love over fear, about the incredible things that become possible when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. What legacy of courage and love are you creating in your own life? What story will you tell when you look back on this moment? Theodore Branham, a young man who had recently arrived in Meadowbrook and who reminded Marcus so much of his younger self, once asked him how he had found the courage to risk his heart after so many years of protecting it. Marcus had thought for a long moment before answering, wanting to give the young man the truth he deserved. "I realized," Marcus had finally said, "that the walls I had built to protect myself from pain were also keeping me from joy. I realized that a life without risk is also a life without reward, and that the fear of being hurt had hurt me more than any rejection ever could have. But most importantly, I realized that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, every single day, even when it's scary, even when it's hard. And that choice, that daily decision to be brave enough to love and be loved, that's what makes us truly alive." The story of Marcus and Rosalind became something of a legend in Meadowbrook, a reminder to everyone who heard it that it's never too late to choose courage over fear, that the walls we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that confine us, and that the greatest risk in life is not the risk of loving and losing, but the risk of never loving at all. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, as autumn gave way to winter and winter to spring, Marcus and Rosalind lived their lives with a fullness and authenticity that inspired everyone around them. They had learned that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone worth fighting for, worth being vulnerable for, worth choosing every single day despite the fear. And in the end, isn't that what we're all searching for? Not the absence of fear, but the courage to love despite it. Not the guarantee of a happy ending, but the willingness to risk our hearts for the possibility of something real and true and beautiful. The choice, as it always has been and always will be, is yours. Will you let fear keep you safe but small? Or will you choose the terrifying, exhilarating path of vulnerability and love? The answer to that question will determine not just the story you live, but the legacy you leave behind.